hope your last week was filled with lots of fun, bouncing around different kinds of balls, manipulating gravity, and generally creating your own universe in a little rectangle. Well, today I'd like to continue with the abstract idea. We're going to look at a lot of tips and tricks for you to add to your After Effects toolbox to make your abstract animations even more spectacular. We're going to watch a piece by Ishu Patel. It's called Perspectum, made in 1975. And then we're going to go on to this After Effects demo that you see here. I'm going to show you how to make something like this very, very easily. All it is multiple squares rotating. It's so fun. And the possibilities are limitless. Now let's take a look at Ishu Patel's Perspectum to give us a reference point for our next tutorial. What a long, strange trip that was. I just love this video for many reasons. First of all, the depth that Patel creates with just two-dimensional objects is really staggering. Just by simply rotating these squares, he's giving us a sense of depth in pure two-dimensional space. It's kind of exciting visually. I also like this part, the dimensionality of it. The dimensionality comes from, again, just manipulating the squares. In this case, if you remember your basic perspective from art class, the stuff in the back is small and the stuff in the front is big, thus creating a sense of perspective and depth. So this two-dimensional object creates this very deep space. He's using multiple iterations of the same source. So this was 1975, so he didn't have After Effects. He was doing this on an optical printer, which uses film. So he's using one shape and iterating it over and over and over again. So really, the only thing truly animated by hand is the first square in any of these cycles. The rest are multiplied mechanically. And how about the color palette? Wow, it's a little bit muted, but it's also strong and intense. The different colors give you different feeling, a different affect. Do the colors remind you of anything? Okay, let's get started with a fresh composition. So I'm going to just mouse on down and hit New Composition. I'm going to call this one Squares 01. Okay, and I'm going to save it in my Art 3550 folder under Practicing. And I'll just save it in here as squares. Easy as pie. So the first thing I'd like to show you is how to use the shape tool. Previously we used masks on a solid to create a shape. But there's this handy little basic shape tool in After Effects. It lives up here between the pan behind tool and the pen tool. It's the rectangle tool. If you click and hold it, it also contains some other fun shapes that you can use to get started on more complex shapes. So we're just going to use the rectangle. And all you do is click and drag out a rectangle. You can have it as big or as small as you want. If you would like to have it completely orthogonal, you can hold Shift and it's going to scale it in exact square proportions to itself. So I'm just holding the Shift and making a square. And so I'm going to make my last square first. So what I'm going to do is make a stack of squares, all from the same square. There, that wasn't so hard, was it? Now I'm going to make sure to click on my selection tool, head on down to the timeline. Hit enter while clicking on your layer and name it. You always want to name your layers. It's really difficult to work with a bunch of layers that have no way to be identified. I'm going to call this square 1. Alright, and if we look in the contents and then into the rectangle 1 itself, we have some options. This object is a vector image made out of math instead of pixels, so it's infinitely scalable. I'm going to open up my fill option and I'm going to pick a nice color. Let's see, what should we pick? How about something blue? I'm feeling a little blue. Let's pick blue. That's a nice electric blue. Hit OK. Alright, now also, this has something called a stroke. It's the outline of the square. So right now it's set to white, and we don't want that. We are going to change it to blue. Our nice electric blue that we've already created. Use the eyedropper after opening the color palette to just mouse over your square and select the blue again. Hit OK. So now our stroke color is blue. Our rectangle is blue. And that is all you have to worry about for this particular shape. Now here comes the fun part. Let's talk about transparency. I believe we've went over transparency a little bit while we were working with the calendar, but it bears repeating. The T key will bring up the opacity modifier. I think T is for transparency, but they call it opacity. Sometimes this can get a little confusing. I am just going to drag down my opacity here, and you can see as I do it, the background, which is completely transparent, these checkers are the indicator that there's nothing there, technically, just blank space or an alpha channel. I'm going to bring my opacity down. Let's type in 30. Let's see what happens. That looks good. Now I'm having trouble kind of understanding the density of my opacity here. So I'm gonna make a background. And we do that by making a quick solid. Click down in the timeline, right click, new solid. Now, what would go good with blue? How about a striking orange? This orange is directly opposite blue on the color wheel. And of course, we have to change the order of the layer by sliding it down underneath the square to see it. Okay, so now I have a transparent square. Before we start multiplying this square, we're going to need to move the anchor point. Now, why would we need to do that? Well, the anchor point is currently set to the middle of the screen, and we do not want that, because if we rotated it, it would rotate around the center of the screen and not rotate around itself. So if we move it use the pan behind tool and snugly snap it in the center. So now when we rotate it, it's rotating around its own center axis. So multiplying things is really easy in After Effects. All you have to do is click on your layer and hit Command D. Command D is duplicate. And now, as we can see, it's made 2 layers, and After Effects was kind enough to even name it for us. So it knows we have 1, and the second one would be 2. So let's make 2 more. Do you see, as we add the translucent squares together, they start to become opaque? It's kind of like lining up some pieces of colored glass and looking through them. And if you have too many layers, you won't be able to see the light come through. So what I'd like to do now is scale each one of these squares by the same percentage. So it's going to give us a stacking effect. I'll show you what I mean. Select the second layer, hit S for scale, and we're just going to scale that down 75%. When I click off of it, you can already see the difference between having the 3 layers and the 4 layers. So on square 3, I'm going to scale that one to 50%. I'm just going down the line, changing things by 25%. And so, by that rationale, we should have the last one at 25%. Very good. Now look at this exciting postmodern shape. That stacked bunch of squares is much more exciting than just one single square. Now, let's start moving this around and see what happens. To close these scale modifiers, we'll just select all the layers while holding Shift and hit S again. And it closes it. Now, I want to start moving the second square. So I'm going to zoom in so I can give myself some room. And I'm going to imagine that it takes 2 seconds for this square to get to where I want it. So I'm going to open my position modifier. Now you can modify multiple positions at the same time by holding Shift and clicking on the remaining layers that you'd like to change. It's just like in any computer software, you can hold Shift to select multiple things. I'm going to turn on my position keyframes, and I'm going to slide down the timeline, and then I'm going to move each one separately a little bit. So I'm going to use the x-axis to pull over layer 2, and then layer 3, and then layer 4. Oh no, we forgot to transform this last layer. No problem. It's too big. We'll just turn the scale modifier on and hit 25. And now it's the size we would like it to be. Put the position modifier back on. So now I should have a nice 2-second animation. Okay, as I'm looking at this, I don't like it when they spread out this far. I just kind of like it when they move to about here. So I want it to stop there. So what I can do is just add some keyframes there. And then get rid of the extra stretchy ones. I just have this little pyramid shape in a two-dimensional space. How fun. But I think it's going too fast. So I'm going to select the final keyframe, hold Shift, and select the final keyframe on all these layers. And slide them on down to the 2-second mark. It's nice and slow. That's almost too slow. Let's compromise and meet halfway. Interesting. I think it should go a little faster. So I think I'd like to do one more thing to this. I like the way that it moves out, but I would also like it to move back in as well. And all I have to do is select this first series of keyframes. So I'm going to move down to my 2-second mark here and just select my first keyframe. Command C copies it. And we want it to go back where it began. So I'm just going to go to the 2-second mark, hit Control V for paste, and paste that keyframe. Looks like it's a little off. So now we've got at least one layer looping. Well, let's do that for the rest. Select the first keyframe, copy, slide on down, holding Shift to snap to that keyframe. Command V, paste. Command C, Command V. You don't even have to move the playhead now. Command C, Command V. Let's take a look. I still think we can do better than that. Let's add some eases to these middle keyframes. Select it, right click, keyframe assistant. Let's and we should probably add some ease outs to this first set as well. Now it's starting to look weirdly mechanical. A little more fluidity with those eases. And let's add some ease in to the last keyframe. Yeah, that looks pretty good. I'm satisfied with it. I think I'm going to increase the space just about 1 frame. Okay. And then I'm going to hold Shift and click on my workspace and snap it to the last keyframes. Now, I don't want this to be my composition. What I would like is just to be able to use this tiny little sequence as a sprite. A sprite in video game making is a little animation that can repeat over and over and over again. So we're going to use this animation as the building block for our abstract pattern. Remember when I set the work area here? I only want my composition to be that long, because if it was this long, and then return to the beginning, it wouldn't feel like it was looping. It would be just hesitating. So let's trim this timeline down. What we can do is trim the timeline to the work area. So what you do is you head on up to the top and go to composition and trim comp to work area. Pow. So what's happened now is our entire composition, we can look at the composition settings, is now only 1 second and 23 frames long. Cool. Now let's start having some fun. I'm going to make a new composition and call it Squares02. You'll see why I'm making, double click, we've got our Squares1 tab. Don't need that one there. I've got my Squares1 tab and a completely empty Squares2 tab. So here's the brilliance of After Effects. This is called nesting. You can take one composition and nest it into the other. So I can click and drag Squares1 into Squares2 and have a single instance of Squares1. This is where it even gets more fun. Do it again. Click and drag. Now we've got two instances on there, but they're on top of one another, so we can't see them. So let's move that position modifier. Uh-oh, we can't see the one underneath it. Why is that? It's because Squares1 has a background. And so if you modify anything in Squares1, we'll turn that background off, and go back to Squares2, it'll make changes to every instance of your iterated timeline. So in this timeline, we can just add a new solid for a background. Instead of orange, let's go kind of an orangey green, yellowy green, yeah. Lime green. Slide that down underneath both of the instances. Now we've got two squares. But there's a little bit of a problem. When we made a new composition, After Effects thinks it only wants us to have 1 minute 23 frame compositions, and that is too short. So with Squares2 active, go up to composition, composition settings, and we're just going to tell this we want it to be, I don't know, 15 seconds. That's better. Now we've got some room to work. Great. Let's do another iteration. Position it, move it down, and let's do one more for thrills. You can either click and drag it down, or you can duplicate it with Command D. Slide it on over. So what have we got? I forgot to add the work area out point. Nice. So I'm going to backtrack for a second and get rid of the last squares that we iterated. Hit delete. Remember how we infinitely looped a layer last week? Let's do that again here. Select the layer, time, enable. So in order to make this really smooth, we've got to finesse After Effects just a little bit. I want to leap this seamlessly, so I'm going to zoom in, and I'm going to add a new time remapping keyframe, one frame behind the very last. And what this is going to tell After Effects to do is basically skip this loop frame where it's invisible. So on this keyframe, it's where you add your expression. So animation, add expression, and go down to property and loop out. Then we can get rid of that last funky keyframe. We'll see if it loops infinitely. By George, I think we got it. So as animators, we can be a little lazy. We don't have to animate every single instance of the animation. We can just have a sprite and multiply it. I'll show you what I mean. So remember, in Squares 1, we just have our basic shape moving. So in Squares 2 is where we can start manipulating things and multiplying them. So let's take this infinitely looping layer and duplicate it. Select it, hit Command D for duplicate. And it's right on top of our last one, so let's move the position over just a little bit. And let's keep doing that. Let's duplicate it again. And slide that one down. And then duplicate it again. And slide it. Oh. Let's duplicate. Sometimes if you get lost and you don't know what layer is what because you haven't named them correctly, you can click on and off the eye switch, and that'll just tell you, and After Effects will just tell you, peekaboo, that's what I'm looking for. I want to duplicate this one and just slide it over on the x-axis. So now I have these 4 squares. What are they going to look like? Well, that's pretty funky. The fun thing about After Effects is you can infinitely nest compositions. So if I make a new composition and call this Square 3, I can take the Square 2 composition and use that as my iterator. Uh-oh, we made the mistake of keeping the background in again. So we can go to Squares 2 and just turn off the lime green solid. And then we can start duplicating. So instead of duplicating 1, now we have 4. I think what I'd like to do is line these up in the middle of the screen. And to do that, I'm going to show you how to use rulers. Rulers allow you to drag guidelines. We go to View, Show Rulers. It's going to give us these handy marks in pixels along the axis. All I have to do is click and drag out a guideline. I'm going to put that one back for just a second. I'm going to go down here to the bottom window and show you something called the grid and guide options. If you click on this, it's going to ask you if you want to look at a proportional grid or a title safe action, action safe template. I'm going to turn that one on because I know that that one has a hash mark in the middle of the screen. And what this is a guide, because sometimes different TVs crop the image a little bit differently. So as a rule of thumb, we want to keep all action within this outer frame, and we want to keep text in the inner frame. And here's our center point. So let's get a guide mark on the center, and then we can turn it off. I'm kind of missing my background. It makes it a little easier to see. I'm going to add a solid. Drag it down. And now I'm going to reposition my instances so they look a little more centered. If I want to turn the guides off, I can just uncheck Show Guides or use Command semicolon. Neat. Let's see how that looks. We have these weirdly syncopated squares. Now the reason why this isn't looping forever is because we did not set the composition. We did not trim the composition length here. So let's do that now. Okay, so just for grins and whistles, let's loop these two nested compositions so we can get them to loop all the way down to the end. I think it bears repeating. We'll select the layer, time, enable timer mapping, go down to the last keyframe, zoom in, move back one keyframe, boink, add a time remapping keyframe there. Select your new keyframe, animation, add expression, in this little menu here, property, loop out. And then you can delete that last vestigial keyframe. When you zoom out, you've got all this area looping. See, this one here, Squares 2, doesn't loop because it doesn't have a looping keyframe, looping expression on it. But the top one does. See how it goes on infinitely? Okay, and so what can you do with this stuff? Well, the sky's the limit at this point. You could even have this, now you can animate it as you would a regular object. So if I wanted to move it up or down, I could definitely do that, and I'm moving the whole instance rather than having to move, like, what is it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 8, 12, 16 different nested pieces. I can just move this entire chunk. Woohoo! I'm having animation fun. And that's going to look absolutely ridiculous. But, you know, gotta have fun where you can get it. So if you have any questions, post them in the Q&A forum, and perhaps your peers can answer those questions. And if they don't get answered after 24 hours or so, I will answer the question myself. Okay, happy animating!